Today's daf is daf Nun, and yesterday we finished the first 10 lines, so we're up to V'tepukle, and the first word of the line is Bipar. So the Gemara beforehand had vacillated back and forth on the following suffix. When the Kohen Gadol shechted the par, and there was Makabel Adam, he didn't get a chance to bring the dam into the Kodesh Kodashim to do the Hazas Hadam, and he died. Now he was replaced by a second Kohen Gadol. And the second Kohen Gadol use the dam and do the Hazah as if nothing had happened? Or is it critical that the second Kohen Gadol do the Shechita? He has to get his own par, because the Torah says, Bezos Yovo Aaron al HaKodesh Bepar ben Bakar Lechatos. And the question was whether or not Yovo Aaron Bepar means his par, the Kohen Gadol who's going inside Bezos Yovo, or as long as the dam is there and the Kohen Gadol is taking the dam, it doesn't matter if he did the shechita or not. That was the suffix of the Gemara. So the Gemara asks, V'tepukle, there's no question that it's impossible to raise the idea that the second Kohen Gadol would bring in the dam from the first Kohen Gadol. That dam, the Gemara says, is possible. It's completely disqualified. And why is that? Because we have a principle called Chata Shemesu Balehi. If a person designates a chatos, and before he gets a chance to bring the chatos on the mizbeach, he dies, then we have halach l'moshe b'Sinai, which is called chatos shemesu ba'aleha, and lemisa azlam. We cannot be makriv, not even the yarshim who inherit their father and usually pick up their father's responsibilities. That doesn't apply because of this halach l'moshe b'Sinai of chata shemesa. And the Gemara Bechoros on Daf Tez Zayin, and in many other places, establishes this halacha l'moshe misinai, that chatos shemesu balea holeches lemisa. And in this case of the par chatos, if the Kohen Gadol was mafresh, the first Kohen Gadol was mafresh this chatos as his par shel Kohen Gadol, and then he died, it's a classic case of chata shemesu baleh the azal of misa. There's no way that you can take this dam and use it on, in any sense, for an avoda, completely pasula krova, and therefore you cannot do a zrika with this dam, can't do azah with this dam. So the Gemara is saying, typically, the entire suffix that you brought up as to whether or not the second Kohen Gadol could use the dam of the first Kohen Gadol is totally irrelevant, because it's a case of Chata Shemesu Baleh. Now, the assumption of the Gemara is that this chatos is what we call a chatos yochid. It's the private individual chatos that's brought by the Kohen Gadol. And therefore, if he dies, then lemisa azl. But there is another concept called a korban tzibur, a chatas of a tzibur. We'll see soon a number of examples of a chatas tzibur. And in that case, if one member of the tzibur dies, it still belongs to the entire tzibur, and there's no din of lemisa azla. So now the Gemara is assuming that since it's the Kohen Gadol who digs into his pocket and he signs the check to purchase this par, it's his par, therefore it's a korban chatas of a yochid, and therefore mesu balel lemisa azla. But what was the suffix in the Gemara as to whether or not the second Kohen Gadol could bring the dam of the first Kohen Gadol? Omale Ravin bar Adol Rava, Amri Talmidach, your students, Rava, told us in the name of Omer of Amram an answer to this question regarding the status of the par chatos shel kohen gadol b'yom kippurim, chatos tzibur. It is not a private chatos, but rather it's a chatos tzibur. What makes it into a chatos tzibur? Because the kapara is not just for the Kohen Gadol, but this par is going to mechaper on Echav HaKohanim, the entire Shevet Kahuna, as the Pasuk says in Parshas Achrimos, V'kriv Aaron es par chatos shelo, v'chiper ba'ado u'biad beiso. And the concept of beiso here is a reference to Echav HaKohanim. And therefore, according to this Gemara, in the name of Rav Amram, the status of the partial Kohen Gadol is that of a chatas tzibur, because the kapara relates to all the Kohanim. And this, despite the fact that it's the Kohen Gadol who, as we said before, signs the check on the par, it's got to come mishalo, but nevertheless, the kapara is the kapara of the tzibur. That gives it the status of a korban tzibur. With regard to a tzibur, we say there's no misa of a tzibur. There's always someone alive from the tzibur. And therefore, that's the principle called ein tzibur, ein tzibur mesim. Individuals could die, but not the tzibur. So with regard to a chatas yachid, a privately owned chatas, we have this halach l'mot shmi of mesu balea is lemisa azla. But in the case of a korban tzibur, a chatas hatzibur, like this case, according to Rabbi Amram, of the parashal kohen gadol, which is mechaper for the echav hakohanim, there's no din of misa, and therefore the Gemara vacillates as to whether or not the second kohen gadol can take this dam and of the par of the first kohen gadol and do the hazah b'fnim. And now the Gemara is going to quote a Mishnah to prove that the status of the partial Yom Kippurim is that of a chatas tzibur. Again, despite the fact that it's purchased by the Kohen Gadol himself. And this is the Mishnah in Tmura on Daf Yud Daled. And the Mishnah establishes, according to the Tanakama is not quoted here on the page in our Gemara here in Masechet Yoma, but it's in the Mishnah in Bechoros, and the Tanakama Shita is that there's something called a korban tzibur, there's something called a korban yachid, and the difference between the two is that a korban tzibur could override the Shabbos. There are many malachas involved in bringing a korban on Shabbos, but for the sake of a korban tzibur, we override the Shabbos. The esat tumah. And a korban tzibur overrides tumah. Normally, in tumah, you're not allowed to even enter into the Beis Hamikdash. But for the sake of a korban tzibur, we're going to allow him to enter into the Beis Hamikdash. A korban yachid, on the other hand, is not dochet Shabbos and not dochet tumah. That's the presentation of the Tanakh. Amalo Rabbi Meir. So the Mishnah records the contention of Rabbi Meir against the Tanakh. Halo par Yom Kippurim. And I'm going to skip for a moment. We'll come right back and fill in the blanks. Korban yachid hu v'doches haShabbos v'esatuma. We know that the partial Yom Kippurim is brought on Yom Kippur. It overrides the Shabbos. We know that it overrides Tumah. And despite the fact that it's a korban yachid. And now we see that Rabbi Meir is arguing against the Chachamim because according to the Chachamim, only a korban tzibur is docha Shabbos, docha Yom Kippur, and docha Tumah. How could you square off with the case of Parashal Kohen Gadol, which is docha Shabbos, docha Tumah, and it's a korban yachid? But from the fact that Rabbi Meir argued against the Chachamim in the case of Parashal Kohen Gadol, claiming that it's a korban yachid, and despite that it's dochet tumah, dochet Shabbos, it means that the Tanakama must have held lav michlal the ikalaman biomar the tzibur. The Tanakama shita was that we classify partial Kohen Gadol as a korban tzibur, and that's why it's dochet Shabbos and dochet tumah. And this would support the answer of Rav Amram that there is a Tana, there is a sheet out there in the Tanaim that the status of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim is that of a carbon tzibur. Now, what we left out were two other categories that Rabbi Meir invokes as a proof for his shita against the Tanakama, and those are Chavite Kohen Gadol, right? The Kohen Gadol on a daily basis had to bring a certain kind of a mincha called Minchas Chavitin. He brought 12 breads, 6 in the morning and 6 in the afternoon, and Korban Pesach. According to Rabbi Meir, Parshal Yom Kippurim, Chavite Kohen Gadol, and a Korban Pesach, all three are Korbanos Yachid, and yet they're Dochet Shabbos and Dochet Tumah. How could you, the Chachamim, the Tanakama, hold that a Korban Tzibur, and only a Korban Tzibur is Dochet Shabbos and Dochet Yom Kippur, but not a Korban Yachid? These cases fit into the category of Korban Yachid. It's the Kohen Gadol who brings the Chavitim from his own money, and a Korban Pesach is brought by each group from their own funds. It's a privately owned corporation, and therefore it's a Korban Yachid, and yet it's Dochet Shabbos and Dochet Tumah. But we see clearly, as we said before, that Parah Shel Yom Kippurim, according to the Tanakama, has the status of a Korban Tzibur. Reb Meir said, wait a minute, that's not true. Parah Shel Kohen Gadol is a Korban Yachid. And how could it be Dochet Shabbos and Dochet Tumah? Chacham apparently held it was a Korban Tzibur. And this supports the approach of Rabbi Amram. Now, Rava is going to reject this proof from the Mishnah in Tmura and the words of Rabbi Meir, and he's going to come to the conclusion that Parshal Yom Kippurim could not be considered a Korban Tzibur. Nobody could hold that it's a Korban Tzibur. It's purchased privately by the Kohen Gadol. Says Rava to Rabbi Amram, Rav Amram Uletamech. According to your diuk, that you want to be medayik from the fact that Rabbi Meir argued that Parah Shel Kohen Gadol, etc., is a Korban Yachid, it means that Tanakama held it was a Korban Tzibur. Then what are you going to do with a brisa? There's a brisa on that Mishnah in Bechorah, in Tmura, that enhances the Mishnah, and it says, Omelo Rabbi Akiva, Omelo Rabbi Yaakov. The Tana Rabbi Yaakov argues against the Chachamim, and the Chachamim said that only a Korban Tzibur is Docha Shabbos and Tumah, and it meant that every single Korban Tzibur is Docha Shabbos and Tumah. So Rabbi Yaakov says, he argues, Halo Par Helim Dovashal Tzibur. It means that if there was a mistaken hora and most of the tzibur violated an iser chomer, they have to bring a par helim dovashal tzibur, and that's a korban chatos, and it's not dochet Shabbos or tumah, even though it's a korban tzibur, par shel tzibur. Useiri avodas kochavim. Or, for example, if the tzibur mistakenly, rovat tzibur, violated avodas kasarim, they're chayv to bring a korban chatos, and Karban Chagiga, which again is brought by most of Klal Yisrael, the Karban Tzibur, and all these three can be classified as a Karban Tzibur. And nevertheless, Ein Dochin Losa Shabbos Losa Tumah. How could you say that a Karban Tzibur is Docha Shabbos and Tzibur? Here's three cases of Karban Tzibur. They're not Docha neither Shabbos nor Tumah. So now let's apply, says Rava, you Rav Hammer's logic in the way you read and interpret the Mishnah, now the Brisa. Are we saying that the Tanakama would hold that these three korbanos have the status of a korban yach? That's impossible. I mean, we know that the korbanos tzibur. It's only the tzibur that brings these korbanos. So therefore, we cannot accept your approach to the dissenting views, respectively, of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yaakov, but rather the Tanakama Komahadale, what the dissenters, meaning the objection of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yaakov was saying to the Tanakama, the Shame the Ka'amar, when they heard him say, the Tanakama, that a carbon tzibur is dochas Shabbos satuma, carbon yochaneted dochalos Shabbos satuma, Amalo Rabbi Meir, and we'll get to Rabbi Yaakov in just a second. Carbon yachid klolahu? Are you saying it's an absolute rule that a carbon yachid could never override Shabbos and or Tuma? Follow partial Yom Kippurim, Chaviti Kohen Gadol, and carbon Pesach are all without a shadow, without a carbon yachid, each one of them, and nevertheless dochenas Shabbos and dochenas Tuma. And the Chaviti Kohen Gadol are brought on every day of the week, 7 days a week, including Shabbos. A carbon Pesach, if Yudalid ben Nisan coincides with Shabbos, we will bring the carbon Pesach. And Parashal Kohen Gadol, by definition, is a carbon that's brought on Yom Kippur. So we see that Yedocha Shabbos in these three cases, despite the fact that these three cases are a carbon Yachid. So don't give me this rule, says Rabbi Meir, that a carbon Yachid cannot be Docha Shabbos. The Omer Lo Rav Yaakov. Now we get to the second objection, that of Rav Yaakov. You're telling me, the Tanakama, that carbon tzibur klolu, that every time you have a carbon tzibur, it's docha Shabbos, docha tumah. That's not so. That rule cannot be an absolute rule. Hello, par helim dover shel tzibur, siri avodas kochavim, vechagiga devadai. These are all certainly carbon tzibur, and yet ain't a dochim losa Shabbos losa tumah. And therefore, the opinion of the joint opinion of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yaakov is as such. This is what we're going to substitute for your klal. The Chachamim, the Tanakama, made a klal that differentiate between Yochid and Tzibur. No. The klal is the following: Kol shezmano kavua. If there's a time element, a certain urgency in the carbon, is then dochenas haShabbos, dochenas haTuma, vafilu b'Yochid. So, for example, Parashal Yom Kippur has to be brought on Yom Kippur. It's a carbon Yochid. Chaviti Kohen Gadol every day of the week, including Shabbos, and Pesach in the case where Yudalit Shechal b'Shabbos. In all these cases, there's a time urgency to bring the carbon, whether it's that day, every day in the case of the Kohen Gadol's Chavitim, whether it's Yudalit B'Nisan in the case of Carbon Pesach, or Yom Kippurim in the case of the Parashal Kohen Gadol. And in these three cases, despite the classification of these carbonates as a carbon yachid, nevertheless, we override the Shabbos, we override Tumah, because it's a time urgent carbon, meaning it's kavua lozman. Kol she'ein kavua, if there's no zman kavua, and he could bring it at a different time, is ein adochalos Shabbos Tumah filu b'carbon tzibur. Even if you have a carbon tzibur, it doesn't necessarily ipso facto mean that it's going to override the Shabbos. It depends if it's man kavu or not man kavu. We have three cases of a carbon tzibur which don't have a time element involved. For example, parahelim davachel tzibur, siri avodas kochavim, and the karma chagiga. Rashi says the karma chagiga can be brought during the entire yontif, what we call tashlum. And if he didn't bring the karma chagiga on the first day of the moed, he could bring it during the 7th day. So that means it's not as man kavua. Man kavua means it's got to be today, and therefore it's not dochesha. So when we come back to the final interpretation of this Mishnah and the Brisa of Rabbi Yaakov, we realize that there's no proof here that the Tanakama holds that Parashal Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur is a carbon tzibur. And that's not what they're arguing about. What they're arguing about is that the Chachamim made a statement that a carbon tzibur is docha Shabbos. And Rabbi Meir said, wait a minute, that's not so, because a Parashal Yom Kippur, Parashal Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim is docha Yom Kippurim and docha Shabbos as well. And it's a carbon yachid. So you see that a carbon yachid, if it has a time element and urgency, it will be docha Shabbos. But there's no argument here about the status of Parashal Kohen Gadol, and for that matter, for Chavite Kohen Gadol or for carbon Pesach. These are all carbon yachid, carbonis yachid. Now, as far as Rav is concerned, that a partial Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim could not be, according to anybody, a carbon tzibur, Abai asks Rava from a brisa, par v'soyer shel Yoma Kippurim she'avdu. So after he was mafresh the par or the soyer of Yom Kippur, they got lost. So he brought a substitute for this par or for this soyer, and now we find the original. Kulam Yamusa. It means that when we find the original, those have to go to death. V'chein. Se'ire avodas kol chavim she'avdu v'hifrish achem tachteim kulam yamusa. So the same thing applies not only to the parvit sarch Yom Kippurim, but also to the se'ire avodas kol chavim. They were lost. They designated a substitute. Now they found the original is kulam yamusa. Why is kulam yamusu? Because what happened is that after they designated the replacement Sa'ir or Par, or in the case of Avodas Kacham, Sa'ir, they brought the new carbon, and that's called carbon Cheniskapru Bailov. The first carbon, when they find it, if it got lost, it's too late to bring that carbon. You cannot bring that carbon because it's already Bailam Cheniskapru. And the din of a chatas after Bailam Kvar Niskapru with the new carbon chatas that was brought on the Mizbeach. The old carbon Pesach is Dina Lemisa, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now, when we say Lemisa, it means that we starve the animal to death. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, here we have two Tanoim that say Yiru Ad Sheyistavu, that we don't starve the animal to death, but rather we wait until it swallows a nail or something out there in the grazing area, and it becomes a balmum. Once it's a balmum, then we could be motzi it lechulin through pidyon, the yimkaru, they sell it. That's a pidyon. And what do we do with the monies that we receive? Yiplu d'meim linedov, which is called kesam mizbeach. Once the Mizbeach HaChitzon is free, and we want to keep it busy, we'll buy Olos Nedava Shel Tzibur, and we'll bring them on the Mizbeach. Now, what's the reason that we don't, according to Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon, we don't apply the principle of Chatas Sheniskapru Baleim Lemisa? And the answer is She'en Chatas Tzibur Mesa. The halacha l'Moshe Misinai that a chatas, once it's this kapru balea, is dina lemisa, and only applies to a chatas yachid. So we see clearly that Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon, who are not going to apply the halacha l'Moshe Misinai of chatas kapru balea dina lemisa in the case of, amongst others, paro shel kohen gadol, they must have held that paro shel kohen gadol has the din, the status of a chatas tzibur, and therefore there's no din of misa in this kapru bailov in the case of a chatas tzibur. So that now Abai raises this objection to Rava. How can you, Rava, deny the fact that there is any Tana who would say that the partial Kohen Gadol is indeed a carbon tzibur, because you, Rava, you're convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt, since it's purchased by the Kohen Gadol, it's a private individual carbon yachid. Here you see two Tanaim who maintain that the status of partial Kohen Gadol is that of a carbon tzibur, despite the fact that the Kohen Gadol is shelling out for the money privately, but the kapara is public for the entire Shevi Kahuna. Amalei, Rava says to Abaye, in order to answer this kasha, my par, what kind of par is the brisa dealing with? You assumed it was the paro shel Kohen Gadol. No, it's the par helim davar shel tzibur, about which the brisa says, according to Rabbi Lazar of Shimon, since it has status of a chatas tzibur, therefore, if this kapru bailov, there's no din of misa because it's a carbon tzibur. But as far as partial Yom Kippur is concerned, no one, says Rava, would maintain that it's a chatas tzibur. Abai says to Rava, wait a minute, let's read the brisa. For her, it says in the brisa, par v'soyer shel Yom Kippur. Tani. You can't tell me that we're talking about a par helim davar shel tzibur. It says shel Yom Kippurim. Says Rabbi, no. You don't put the comma in the right place. Ki katani, that which it says in the brisa shel Yom Kippurim ad soyer. That's referring to soyer. So you read the brisa in the following way: this par, and that's referring not to par shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim, but rather to the par helim davar shel tzibur, comma, and then v'soyer shel Yom Kippurim, and the soyer of Yom Kippurim, which clearly is a classic case of a korban tzibur. So the ball is now in Abayi's court because he has another brisa to object to Rav. About Tanya, we have a brisa that says par shel Yom Kippurim. It says explicitly shel Yom Kippurim, and then soyer shel Yom Kippurim. So we're not talking about a par helim davar shel tzibur. Sha'avdu v'ifrish tachteim kulam yamutzli Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Lazar Omer, Rabbi Shimon Omer, yiru ad sheyistavu yimachru v'yiplu tmeim linedava she'ein chatas tzibur mesa. So we see clearly, explicitly, that according to Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon, a par shel Yom Kippurim has the status of a chatas tzibur. So Rav is going to answer, lo tema, don't assume in this brisa that Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon are saying, shelo yamusu because she'ein chatas tzibur mesa. And if you translate the words of Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon literally, both in the Mishnah and in the brisa, we're talking about chatas tzibur. No. Ela ema, we're going to slightly change the lashon of the brisa, or the interpretation of the brisa, and that is ein chatas hashutfim mesa. In other words, in a case where you have a number of owners of bailim, of partners over a korban, and one of them dies, or we replaced it with another korban, so then we're going to say that ein chatas hashutfim mesa. So therefore, the status of the partial Yom Kippurim, according to Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon, is that of a chatas hashutfim. And why is it shutfim? Because the kapara of the partial Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim is related not only to the Kohen Gadol himself, but also to his fellow Kohanim. So the Gemara asks the following question, kind of like a naive question. Let's understand why Rava rejected the answer of Rabbi Amram. U'may nafkamina. What did Rava want to gain by saying that the partial Yom Kippurim is not a chatas tzibur, but rather a chatas shutfim? And that forced him to argue against Rav Amram. What difference it makes? This par cannot be holech lemisa, whether you call it and classify it as a chatas tzibur or as a chatas shutfim. So the kasha here that chatas shemesu baleh holeches lemisa azal lemisa, and how could the second Kohen Gadol take the dam into the Kodesh Kadosh, the dam of the par of the first Kohen Gadol? Rav Amram gave an excellent point here. He said that the chatas is not holeches lemisa because it has a din of chatas hatzibur. So Rav says no, it's a chatas hashutfim. At the end of the day, Rav is going to embrace the same answer as Rav Amram. And the reason why the suffix is a very good suffix, very relevant as to whether that the second Kohen Gadol, after the first dies, can bring the dam in, is because ein chatas hatzibur mesa, and the din of azal misa, the halacha Moshe Sinai, that should apply when the Kohen Gadol dies, does not apply to the partial shall Kohen Gadol for one of two reasons. So either the way Rav Amram classifies it as a korban tzibur and ein hatzibur mesim, or the way Rava classifies it as a korban hashutfim, and there's no din of mesu baleh with regard to shutfim. There's no din of azal misa. So why did Rav object to the answer of Rav Amram to our question? How could there be a suffix about the second Kohen Gadol? The Gemara answers that you're right. As far as that question is concerned, it's not a difficult question at all, whether or not you classify it as Rav Amram did, that the partial Kohen Gadol is a chatas hatzibur, or as Rava did, is a chatas ha-shutfim. But rather, The reason why Rava rejected Rav Amr's answer by classifying Paro Shel Kohen Gadol as a carbon tzibur, you could come to a very, very big mistake. We have to avoid a toes. The lo maisi kohanim par bora. If Rav Amram classifies the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol as a carbon tzibur, you might come to the conclusion, therefore, that in a case where Shevet Kahuna made a mistake, let's say the Bezdin Shel Kohen made a mistake, an error, and as a result of the toes, the entire Shevet Kahuna, Rov Shevet Kahuna, violated an Isur Chamur, maybe you would say that based on Rav Amram, you come to the mistake conclusion that would warrant and generate a Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur, because Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur applies even if a Shevet, one of the Shvatim, would have violated this Isur Kares, Bitos, based on Ora's Bezdin, a mistaken Ora. And you might say that, you know what, Shevet Kahuna is like any other Shevet. And therefore, if Shevet Kahuna would violate an Isur Pi Ora's Bezdin Shel Kohanim, they would bring a Par Helim Shel Tzibur. It says, Rava, that's not true. That's a grave error. Because as far as Kohen is concerned, lo notlu chelek the Eretz Yisrael, and the halach of Kahal with regard to Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur, as the Gemara derives it in Masechet Horiyos Daf Vav, only applies when there's an entire shevet which is called Kahal. And Rava himself would say that Shevet Levi is considered a Kahal. But Kohanim, that's not considered a Kahal. So the Par Kohen Gadol Shel Yom Kippurim, if you would accept Rav Amram's classification and define it as a Chatas Tzibur, the Talmidim would make a mistake. They would think that the Kohanim are called a Kahal. You called it a Korban Tzibur. And therefore, if they made a Horas Bezdin B'tos, they have to bring a Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur. Therefore, Rava objected not to the answer of Rav Amram, but to the formulation and the exact choice of definitions and terms that Rav Amram was using by calling a Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur a Korban Tzibur. You could come to a mistaken conclusion. Therefore, the precise definition of Par Helim Dover of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippurim is a Korban Tzibur. Toshma. Now we're going to raise a kasha on Rava, who said that Parashal Yom Kippurim is certainly not a Chatas HaTzibur, based on a suffix that we're going to learn now to boy Rabbi Loza.